Hey, storytellers. Mary Rosewood here, and today I want to talk about the Barbie movie. Now, I know this was a summer movie, part of the Barbenheimer adventure, which I happily took part in. I saw Barbie, I saw Oppenheimer, but it's back in the news right now because of the Oscar nominations. And I just had a chance to rewatch the film while I was flying recently. It was offered on the plane. And I thought, in the wake of the extreme box office success of this film, I mean, it's caught the hearts and minds and imaginations of viewers all over the world to the tune of over $1 billion at the box office, multiple Academy Award nominations. Let's look at the story structure of Barbie and see, as they say, success leaves clues. Let's see what we can learn and put to use in our own writing about how to get a great story started. Now, before I dive into this exploration of the Barbie movie, and I just want to tell you, I'm going to focus primarily on the characters of Barbie and Ken because to analyze a whole screenplay would take a little bit more time than we have today. But let me introduce myself. My name is Mary Rosewood. I myself am an author. I'm best known for writing middle grade fiction, and I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller, which is my own platform for teaching and mentoring writers. You can find out more about Path of the Storyteller at www.pathofthestoryteller.com. So I spend a lot of time with my students talking about this very issue, which is how can you set your storytelling up for success before we even get to page one? Because the truth is, if you are on page one of your draft and you don't yet know in what manner you intend to engage your reader, with what character, with what dramatic questions or what storytelling, it's already too late, Page one is where we have to grab our readers. And the essence of doing this is understanding that the need for transformation of character is what the reader is there for. Transformation is basically another word for story. So when we look at a really successful story, like the Barbie movie, the first question that I want to look at is whose story is it and what need for transformation has been baked into the premise before the story even gets started. Now, I want to point out that the Barbie movie does this not once, but twice with two iconic, irresistible principal characters. You guessed it, Barbie and Ken. We're going to talk about both of them. And the need for transformation in each of these characters is beautifully established, but it's established in different ways, which, to my mind, makes this even more of a valuable sort of learning text because we can learn two different approaches to offering our readers a principal character who's got this compelling need for change baked in. So I know Barbie is the protagonist, but I want to start with Ken because, in a way, his story is more easy to spot. It's more visible to the naked eye. So, who is Ken? Ken is a doll. And when we meet him, we instantly see that both externally and internally, he's got big problems. And his external problem is this: built into his very nature by his makers at Mattel is his role that he's Barbie's boyfriend and he's in love with Barbie and Barbie is it for him. There is no other plastic woman in the world but Barbie. This is his fate in a sense. And just like in a Greek tragedy, his fate is a vicious one because Barbie does not feel the same way about Ken. And so he's stuck in this perpetual unrequited longing and for eternity, right? Because he's a doll. It's a very poignant situation to invent for a character. I mean, it's immediately engaging and compelling. The external difficulty that Ken has regarding always wanting Barbie and never being able to have her is great, and it's definitely enough to make us root for him, to feel for him, and to kind of get on his side, knowing that this has got to be something that's resolved by the end of his story. It's just so vivid. But like any well-rounded character, he also has an internal need for change. And it's related to the external need for change, which is good. He has no idea who he is without his longing for Barbie. He doesn't have a Ken, right? This is so humorously and beautifully expressed in the opening of the film. He's just Ken. It's Ken and Barbie. There is no just Ken, right? And so this is the kind of internal need for change. It's like a psychological or even spiritual problem that has to be addressed by the story as well. So whenever we have an external circumstance that's just unsustainable, like his forever unrequited love for Barbie, and an internal landscape that's just crying out for transformation, that his total lack of a sense of self without the reflection of this other person's affection, which he can never have. I mean, you've got a story there, right? You've got a character there who's just pulsing with story energy. So when I use the phrase, which I often do, the story is baked into the premise of the character. This is what I mean. Nothing has to happen in the movie for this to to be arranged. This is what's on the table when the curtain comes up. Yes, things then start to happen, but it's baked into the premise before the story even begins that this character has this urgent, poignant need for change. And the minute we encounter him, we're going to feel it and we're going to be on his side rooting for it. We're going to really want to know how this plays out. So that's reader engagement or viewer engagement. Now, that seems like a lot for Ken if Barbie is the protagonist of the movie, but let me just take a little side trip into the world of subplots. Whenever you have a secondary character who has such a beautifully well-developed arc of transformation themselves, to me, that's what constitutes a real subplot. Ken is part of Barbie's plot. The two plots, the main plot and the subplot, are beautifully interwoven. But there are times that they separate, and we see that Ken actually has his own arc of development and transformation. It's smaller than Barbie's. In a way, it's less complicated than Barbie's, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. He's definitely the subplot, right? There's no confusion about whose story it is, but it's so well developed, kind of alongside hers, smaller, and more direct. It's so well developed that that meets my standards of a beautifully achieved subplot. So let's talk about the main plot, which is Barbie's plot. Now, I just described how Ken's circumstances externally and internally scream for change. They're just not okay. His world is not okay the way it is, right? Barbie's the opposite, isn't she? Barbie is perfect and should be the first one to tell you. Her world is perfect. Her dream house is perfect. Her friends are perfect. Her breakfast is perfect. Her waffle is perfect. Her car is perfect. Her feet are perfect. Her clothes are perfect. Everything about Barbie is, in a way, it's like the perfect expression of perfection. It's so over the top. It takes perfection to its limit. And so this is the very exemplification of a world in which, at first glance, nothing needs to change. Nobody's complaining. Everyone seems happy. Maybe there's a couple of flies in the ointment. I'm thinking of Alan. But Barbie herself does not see a need for change, right? Quite unlike Ken, who's keenly aware of his own feelings. Barbie is self-satisfied to the max. She considers her world perfect. She considers herself perfect. And it's the opening move of the storytelling in the film to demonstrate this over-the-top self-satisfaction, perfection in every aspect, and Barbie's stated desire, which is quite clearly communicated, that she just doesn't want anything to ever change. So, where's the story energy in that? So this is why it's a bit of a more subtle character setup, because the character herself does not see it. She's not feeling any pain at the beginning of the film. But who can see past this? This is an interesting point. The viewer can see past it. The reader, if it were a novel, the reader can see past it. So one of the things that you have to remember when you are a storyteller is that you are telling a story to someone, and that someone is a human being. that someone brings their own capacity for insight and, importantly, their own fluency in the ways of story to the experience of your story. And any reader, even a very small child, I'm quite confident of this, would look at a situation where the character is walking around saying, I'm perfect, everything's perfect, nothing need ever, 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 ever change, and go, wait a minute, nobody's perfect. The world, that's not right. Everything changes, right? Change is the only constant. And so a world in which, you drink a glass of milk that's got nothing in it and your feet are permanently planted in, sky high heel shoes, you may say it's perfect. Some of us are looking at it on the outside and saying, oh, Barbie, you have so much to learn. And so the viewer actually brings an awareness to the story that the character themselves does not yet have. Interestingly, and I expect that nobody's compared these two characters before, but one of my favorite, truly iconic characters in literature who also shares this kind of setup is, of course, Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. When you open this, flawless little novella and you meet Ebenezer Scrooge for the first time, he is not sitting around moping, saying, I have become such a miser. I'm clearly an unhappy person. I wish I were closer to my nephew and that I had more friends. Perhaps I ought to go on a journey of change. No, that's the opposite of what Ebenezer Scrooge is all about when we meet him. He is in such a spiritually corrupt situation at the beginning that he's just projected all of that outward. He thinks he's fine. It's everyone around him who's a problem, right? Bob Cratchit's lazy. The guys asking for charity are foolish. His nephew is annoying. He may not say he's perfect. It's not a phrase that he utters the way Barbie does, but he's not aware at the very top of the tail of his need for change. But boy, oh boy, the minute the reader gets a look at this guy, don't we sit back and say, oh boy, you've got so much to learn. We have the same reaction that we have to Barbie, which is, yeah, you've got a lot to learn, my dear. Well, let's buckle in because this character is about to go on a big, meaningful journey of transformation. In other words, a terrific story is about to begin. That's where the reader engagement comes from, that sense that a terrific story must be about to begin. Why? Because this character really needs it. This character can't stay this way, right? So one of the images that you can think about is what happens, before the curtain comes up. I'm an old theater person, right? So I always like to use these theater images. Many writers mistakenly think that we sort of start with our character in a kind of almost in a blank way, and that we spend our opening 5 pages, 10 pages, however many pages, getting them into a state of difficulty so that then there is a need for change. But I I emphasize this with my students at Path of the Storyteller all the time. You can't spend the first 5 or 10 pages getting your character into a state of difficulty so that the need for a story happens. You're starting too late then, right? You've just wasted the first 5 or 10 pages. You need to do that work so that when the curtain comes up, that need for transformation is baked into the core of the character, right? Baked into the premise of the storytelling. So then you can begin the story by making it urgent. Here's an image for you. If you think about diving, perhaps, you want to begin your story with your main character all the way at the edge of the diving board, right? And their toes are already hanging over the edge, and maybe they're bouncing up and down a little bit. Now, they could stand there for a while, but it's precarious, right? The forward lean, if you will, of the fact that they're about to take this big dive and end up in the water of transformation is palpable. It's palpable, but they haven't taken the dive yet. But the leaning into the story, the need for the story to start is already there in the first line, the first paragraph, the first page. Now, what do we spend the beginnings of our stories doing? Well, giving them that little shove off the diving board, of course. But if they're not on the diving board already when the story starts, you don't want to waste your first couple of chapters getting them on it. It's too late, you know. So this is why we often talk about starting the story as late as possible. It's why often when a writer comes to me with a manuscript and I'll say, you know, you don't need the prologue, you don't need the first few pages, like your story really starts where you've got your current chapter 2. It's just a really common impulse to try to work out all of this unsustainable stuff about our characters on the page. The reader doesn't need to see it. That's your job to do, so that when the curtain comes up, this idea that Barbie is already living in a perfect world and it's not sustainable because it doesn't actually provide a meaningful existence. It doesn't allow her to have any possibility of connecting with humanity, which of course turns out to be what the story's about. That's already there. That work's already been done. We meet her in the full flesh of that, right? And then very, very quickly, she's pushed off the diving board as things start to happen that reveal that there's a problem, right? And Ken, similarly, his dilemma of being designed to love and only love a woman who can never love him back. Oh, it's baked into the premise of who he has always been. His lack of sense of knowing who he might be without his connection to this woman who could never feel the same way about him that he feels about her. You know, he doesn't know who he is, right? Without Barbie, there is no Ken. That's also been ongoing. So, I mean, he is really out on that diving board, bouncing up and down in an unsustainable situation. So, this is our job as storytellers, to know what the journey of change must be for our characters, and to get that on the page right at the beginning of our storytelling. It's the key to reader engagement. It's the key to writing those much longed for, powerful, irresistible first 10 pages that, you know, agents asked for, publishers asked for, contests asked for. Writers often say to me, how do I make my first 10 pages as good as possible? And this is the answer, is that you start your story on page 1 with the need for transformation baked into the premise, because we don't need to read anything more to convince us that we are buckled in to see, how is this going to get solved? How is Barbie going to both come to realize that this illusion of perfection is not a meaningful existence, and what's going to happen to her when she finds out? What is Ken going to do about this lifelong, like the seemingly eternal sentence, you know, to always live in unrequited love and an empty sense of self? How is that going to change? What's going to happen to shake Ebenezer Scrooge out of his bitterness and his miserliness, right? And welcome him back into the family of humanity? We need to know. And if you establish it on page 1, your reader will keep reading until the very end. So thank you for being here for this conversation. I hope it's of benefit to you. Thank you for all the good storytellers out there, the creators of the Barbie movie, who did such a good job. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the success of this movie and the way it's connected with viewers is remarkable. And whether the film is to your personal taste or not, of course, there is no one story that is a universal attractant. Some people won't be interested in the story, but success does leave clues. And when something is able to connect that broadly with so many people across culture, across ages, you know, we can look for the tried and true principles of storytelling to explain why. And when you start to work intentionally with those principles in your own writing, you too are going to see a huge change, a big improvement in how well and how swiftly your work connects with readers. Thanks for being here. If you're new to the channel, once again, I'm Mary Rose Wood. I hope you'll like the video if it was a benefit, and please do subscribe. This is where I talk about story structure, writing craft, and the mindset of the working, thriving writer. So if you like that kind of content, I hope you'll be back. Thanks for being here today.